They whispered she wouldn't make it through the first day. That limp made her a liability. They said every painful step she took during training seemed to confirm what the entire selection course already decided. She was the broken one, the misfit, the soldier who should never have been allowed to try. But when the 72-mile endurance march began, something changed. The ones who laughed stopped smiling. The ones who doubted fell behind. And the woman they all underestimated kept moving forward, one steady step after another until the impossible happened. Dawn broke over Fort Benning's Special Operations Assessment Course, painting the Georgia pines in hues of amber and gold. 58 candidates stood at rigid attention as Master Sergeant Daxon moved down the line, clipboard in hand. His voice carried across the dewy field with military precision as he called each name. Sergeant Freya Huxworth. A beat of silence followed. Several heads turned subtly, searching for the source of the name. From the edge of the formation, a compact woman with short auburn hair stepped forward. "Present, Sergeant." Her voice was clear and steady, betraying nothing of the slight asymmetry in her stance. Captain Evander Thorne watched from beneath the brim of his patrol cap, his weathered face revealing nothing as he exchanged glances with his cadre of instructors. The morning light caught on Freya's face, serious, eyes forward as whispers rippled through the predominantly male candidates. "Welcome to selection," Daxon announced, pacing before them. "Over the next 3 weeks, we will determine who among you deserves to join the ranks of our elite operational teams. By day's end, some of you will already be gone. By week's end, half of you." His gaze lingered briefly on Freya. "The standards are absolute. There are no accommodations, no exceptions." The morning's initial physical assessment began with a 5-mile qualification run. As the group set off along the red clay trail, Freya's awkward gait became immediately apparent. Her left leg moved differently, a slight hitch that disrupted her rhythm, forcing compensation with each stride. While the lead pack quickly separated from the formation, Freya settled into the back quarter, her face set in concentration. Staff Sergeant Zane, monitoring the middle checkpoint, noted the time as she passed. "Cutting it close, Sergeant," he remarked, though not unkindly. Freya merely nodded, conserving energy as she pushed forward. When she finally crossed the finish line, her time was barely within qualifying standards. Sweat darkened her t-shirt, but her breathing, while heavy, was controlled. Unlike some who collapsed or doubled over retching, she remained standing, hands on hips, recovering with methodical breaths. Captain Thorne made a note on his clipboard as Daxon muttered something beside him. "She made standards," Thorne replied quietly. "Barely. She won't survive the week." The day continued with strength assessments, tactical problems, and equipment familiarization. Throughout each evolution, Freya performed adequately, but never exceptionally. Her pull-ups met the minimum requirement. Her marksmanship was proficient. Her tactical decisions were sound, if unremarkable. But whenever movement was involved, her limitation was evident. That evening in the female barracks, nearly empty with only 3 women among the candidates, Freya methodically organized her equipment. The building was divided with thin walls separating the women's quarters from the much larger men's bay. Through these walls, voices carried clearly. "Did you see that, Limp?" Lieutenant Calloway's voice was distinct. "Affirmative action's getting desperate if we're taking the walking wounded now." Laughter followed, then another voice. "Bet she's gone by morning PT. That leg won't hold up. $20 says she doesn't make the first obstacle course." More laughter. The other 2 women exchanged uncomfortable glances, but said nothing to Freya, who continued preparing her gear as though she hadn't heard. Later, alone in her corner bunk, Freya removed a photograph from a waterproof pouch in her rucksack. Herself in desert camouflage, somewhere dusty, arm around a soldier whose face was obscured by shadow. She studied it briefly before tucking it away. Then, with practiced movements, she rolled up her pant leg and applied medicated cream to a mass of scar tissue covering her thigh, her fingers tracing the ridges of healed incisions. The ritual had the weight of hundreds of repetitions, mechanical, necessary, and private. Days blurred together as the candidates faced increasingly difficult challenges. The obstacle course became a particular theater for Freya's struggles. While others vaulted walls and swung across ropes with relative ease, her movements were careful, deliberate. She never failed an obstacle, but she was invariably among the last to complete them. During team exercises, Sergeant Braddock, a broad-shouldered former college athlete with an easy smile and sharp eyes, deliberately assigned her the heaviest equipment. Just evening the playing field, he explained with a smirk when Zane questioned the distribution. Everyone carries their weight here. Freya accepted the extra radio equipment without comment, adjusting her load before moving out with her team. The added weight made her limp more pronounced, but she kept pace, her jaw tight with determination. On the rope climb, disaster nearly struck. Halfway up the 30-foot rope, Freya's left leg failed to properly secure her position. She slipped, sliding several feet before regaining her grip, the rough hemp burning her palms. Immediate laughter erupted from a cluster of male candidates waiting their turn. "Gravity's a bitch, Huxworth," called one. "Maybe they'll let you use the ladder instead," added another. Freya said nothing, simply readjusted her grip, found a different technique, and continued upward. Slower than everyone else, but refusing to descend. When she reached the top, no one applauded, but Staff Sergeant Zane nodded slightly before calling the next candidate forward. During land navigation exercises, Freya found herself intentionally excluded. When teams formed, candidates grouped together quickly, leaving her to work alone. Captain Thorne observed this from a distance, but made no intervention. Selection was as much about mental resilience as physical capability, and social isolation was a test in itself. To everyone's surprise, Freya performed exceptionally well at land navigation, returning with all points located well within the time limit. Her route selections showed an unusual efficiency, not the most direct paths, but the most energy-conserving ones, avoiding unnecessary elevation changes while maintaining concealment. Military intelligence background? Zane asked as she turned in her scorecard. "No, sir." "Combat search and rescue." Zane's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he asked nothing more. When a fierce storm hit during overnight field exercises, the candidates were scattered across their patrol bases with minimal equipment. Temperature dropped rapidly as rain turned to sleet, soaking through uniforms and creating miserable conditions. In Freya's patrol base, she quietly constructed a more effective shelter than the standard hasty setup others employed, using terrain features and natural materials to create better insulation and drainage. Staff Sergeant Zane, conducting night inspections, paused at her position longer than others, noting the unusual field craft. "Where'd you learn this technique?" he asked quietly. "Survival school, plus some adaptations," she replied, not elaborating further. By the end of the first week, the candidate pool had dropped from 58 to 42 as weaker members quit or failed standards. Most had expected Freya to be among them. Yet she remained, never excelling, but steadily meeting requirements. The whispers changed from dismissal to confusion, though the mockery continued. Late one night, Captain Thorne reviewed personnel files by lamplight in his office. When he reached Freya's, his brow furrowed at the unusual number of redacted sections and classified pages. Her service record showed distinguished service in Afghanistan and 3 unnamed locations, but specific details of her deployments were heavily censored. Medical records indicated multiple surgeries at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, followed by an extensive rehabilitation period, but the nature of her injuries was not fully disclosed. Something about her history didn't align with the struggling candidate he'd been observing. He made a phone call to an old colleague at Special Operations Command. "Jim, it's Thorne. I need clearance on a file. Sergeant Freya Huxworth, currently in my selection course. Her records are blacked out like a CIA holiday calendar." He listened for a moment. "Yes, that's right." Limps noticeably. Another pause. "Understood. Just curious what I'm actually working with here." By the end of the second week, the candidate pool had dropped further to 31. The remaining candidates showed the effects of constant physical stress, weight loss, fatigue, minor injuries accumulating. Freya's limp seemed more pronounced, but she maintained the same quiet determination she'd arrived with. At the evening instructor meeting, the cadre reviewed each remaining candidate before the final phase, the dreaded crucible march that would determine who received placement in the operational teams. Huxworth still hanging in, remarked one instructor with mild surprise. Staff Sergeant Zane nodded. She's resourceful. Better tactically than most give her credit for. Doesn't matter, Master Sergeant Daxon dismissed. She won't make the final phase. The crucible will break her. Nature's way of sorting things out. As the meeting adjourned, Captain Thorne remained behind, staring at a newly arrived file marked classified. Inside was a brief medical summary with phrases like catastrophic femoral fracture, nerve damage, and recommended medical discharge. Attached was a citation for a silver star that had apparently never been formally presented. Meanwhile, in her bunk, Freya sat alone, methodically preparing her equipment for tomorrow's crucible march. She checked each item twice, arranged her rucksack for optimal weight distribution, and taped potential hot spots on her feet. Her face remained set with quiet determination as she worked late into the night, ignoring the ache in her leg that never truly subsided. In her mind flashed a brief memory. Sterile hospital walls, the scent of antiseptic, doctors standing over her with grave expressions. With this level of damage, you'll never run normally again. Military career's over. Best to accept it. Freya's hands never faltered in their preparations as she pushed the memory away, focusing instead on the challenge ahead. 0400 hours. 31 remaining candidates stood in darkness at the mountain trailhead, headlamps creating a constellation of light points against the pre-dawn sky. Each bore an identical 80-pound rucksack filled with equipment, rations, and water, the same weight regardless of body size. The atmosphere was tense, charged with nervous energy and exhaustion from 2 grueling weeks of selection. Captain Thorne addressed them briefly, his voice carrying in the cold mountain air. The Crucible March represents the final test of your selection. 72 hours, 72 miles, 9 checkpoints that must be reached within designated time frames. Miss one, you're done. He paused, scanning their faces in the dim light. Medical emergencies are the only acceptable reason for evacuation. The course record is 68 hours. Nobody expects you to break it. His eyes rested briefly on Freya, positioned at the back of the formation. Her expression remained neutral, but she adjusted the straps of her rucksack with practiced efficiency. Unlike some who shifted nervously or bounced on their toes, she stood completely still, conserving energy. Your time begins now, Thorne announced, starting his watch. Without fanfare, the candidates began moving along the trail, headlamps bobbing as they disappeared into the dense forest. Freya settled into position near the rear of the pack, establishing a rhythm that accommodated her uneven gait. The first few miles passed in relative silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel and the occasional murmur as candidates checked their bearings. The terrain started gently enough, a wide Forest Service road that allowed them to spread out according to their preferred pace. By mile 8, the first casualty occurred. A tall candidate named Reeves collapsed with severe cramping, unable to continue despite attempts to stretch and hydrate. Medical staff appeared on ATVs, evaluating his condition before removing him from the course. As they departed, Freya passed the scene without breaking stride, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Lieutenant Calloway glanced back as she passed. "Surprised you're still with us, Huxworth," he called. When she didn't respond, he turned to Sergeant Braddock. $10 says she's next to drop." Braddock grinned. "You're on." The terrain began to change as they approached mile 15, transforming from relatively flat forest floor to steep switchbacks climbing the first major ridge. The increased elevation gain tested everyone's endurance, forcing adjustments in pace. Lieutenant Calloway and Sergeant Braddock, who had been leading the formation, began showing signs of fatigue, adjusting pack straps frequently, breathing becoming increasingly labored. Freya maintained the same measured stride she'd started with. Her limp remained evident, but her movement had a mechanical consistency that never varied regardless of the changing incline. She passed her first exhausted colleague at mile 18, a stocky candidate who had been vocal about his CrossFit background during training. He sat on a fallen log, head between his knees, trying to fight off nausea. Without breaking stride, she extended a water purification tablet. "Electrolytes," she said simply before continuing on. By mile 22, the sky had begun to darken ominously. The temperature dropped noticeably as clouds rolled in from the west, obscuring the peaks ahead. Captain Thorne and Staff Sergeant Zane monitored from Checkpoint 3, watching as candidates staggered in with increasing signs of strain. When Freya arrived, now in the middle of the pack, her breathing remained controlled while others gasped for air. Though her uniform was sweat-soaked, her eyes remained alert, focused. "Holding up, Sergeant?" Thorne asked, studying her closely. "Moving steady, sir," she replied, adjusting her rucksack. She declined the offered 10-minute rest period, instead quickly refilling her water, consuming a protein bar, and continuing on without further comment. Zane watched her disappear around the bend. "She's actually gaining position," he noted with surprise. "For now," Thorne replied, though his tone lacked conviction. The weather deteriorated rapidly after the 30-mile mark. What began as light precipitation transformed into torrential rain that turned the trail into a treacherous series of mud slicks and standing water. Night fell early under the heavy cloud cover, forcing candidates to navigate by headlamp through increasingly hazardous conditions. The medical tent at Checkpoint 5 filled quickly with candidates suffering from hypothermia, exhaustion, and injuries from falls on the slippery terrain. Morale plummeted as the night wore on, marking hour 30 of continuous movement with no substantial rest. "How many still on course?" Thorne asked the medic tracking progress. 12, sir," came the reply. 8 evacuated for medical. 11 voluntary withdrawals. Captain Thorne raised his eyebrows slightly. "More than half eliminated already. Faster than typical attrition." The medic consulted his chart. "Lieutenant Mercer has maintained lead throughout. Stevens and Rodriguez following about 30 minutes behind. Then Calloway and..." He paused, double-checking his data. "Sir, Sergeant Huxworth has moved to 5th position." Thorne's expression changed subtly. "Confirm that." "Confirmed at last checkpoint, sir. She's been advancing steadily while others slow." The storm continued through the night and into the following day, creating miserable conditions that tested mental fortitude as much as physical endurance. Candidates who had trained in ideal conditions now faced nature at its most unforgiving. Cold rain, mud-choked trails, and the relentless need to keep moving forward despite every bodily instinct to stop. At mile 50, only 9 candidates remained on course. Lieutenant Mercer had maintained his lead, his military background and ultra-endurance events showing in his consistent performance. But the gap was closing as fatigue accumulated, hour by hour, step by step. Dawn broke on the final day, 60 hours into the march. Staff Sergeant Zane manned Checkpoint 8, stamping his feet against the morning chill as he waited for the first arrivals. He expected Mercer, who had maintained his lead throughout, to appear first around the bend in the trail. Instead, 2 headlamps appeared almost simultaneously. Mercer's familiar tall frame came into view, but only steps behind him was a smaller figure with a distinctive asymmetric gait. "Sergeant Huxworth," Zane said, unable to keep surprise from his voice as they both arrived at the checkpoint. Mercer looked back, genuine shock registering on his exhausted face when he realized who had nearly caught him. He quickly composed himself, checking in with Zane before moving to refill his water supply. Freya said nothing, simply presenting her checkpoint card for validation. Her uniform was caked with mud, her face drawn with fatigue, but her eyes remained alert and focused. "Where were you deployed before this, Sergeant?" Zane asked as she refilled her canteen. "All over," she answered vaguely. Mostly classified CSAR operations. Something clicked in Zane's memory, a fragment of a mission report he'd read years earlier. A helicopter extraction gone wrong. But before he could pursue the thought, Freya had sealed her canteen and was moving again, now visibly gaining on Mercer's distant figure as he struggled up the next incline. The final stretch of the crucible featured the most challenging terrain, steep switchbacks climbing nearly 2,000 feet in elevation before descending sharply to the finish point. It was here that even the strongest candidates faced their breaking point, where accumulated fatigue and depleted resources pushed human endurance to its limits. Mile 67. Lieutenant Mercer had maintained his lead by sheer force of will, but his pace had slowed dramatically. His formerly fluid stride had degenerated into a staggering march, each step a conscious effort. When he reached the top of a particularly steep section, he paused momentarily to adjust his pack. The pause became longer than intended. His legs began to tremble uncontrollably. He tried to take another step forward, but found his body refusing to respond. Mercer swayed once, twice, then collapsed to his knees, his system finally shutting down from severe dehydration despite his disciplined water consumption. As medical staff rushed to his aid from a nearby monitoring point, a lone figure crested the ridge behind him. Freya, moving with the same measured pace she'd maintained from the start. She stopped briefly beside Mercer, kneeling to check his condition. "Medics are coming," she told him, helping him into a recovery position. "You pushed too hard on the ascent." Mercer looked up at her, bewilderment mixing with respect. "How are you still moving?" he managed. She didn't answer, instead ensuring he was stable before preparing to continue. As she rose, Zane arrived with the medical team, having followed from the last checkpoint to monitor the front runners. "We've got him," Zane assured her. "You should keep moving if you can." Freya nodded. But as she turned to continue, Zane noticed blood darkening her left pant leg. A slice from an unseen branch or rock had opened a gash that was bleeding freely. "Hold up. That needs attention," he ordered, pointing to the wound. "I'll manage," she replied. But the medic was already moving toward her with his kit. "Protocol," the medic insisted. "Wound check required before you continue." Reluctantly, Freya allowed him to examine the injury. The medic needed to cut away the fabric to access the wound properly, revealing her leg for the first time during the entire selection process. What became visible wasn't just the fresh injury, but extensive surgical scars running the length of her thigh. Metal pins visible beneath the skin, tissue grafts, evidence of catastrophic injury reconstructed through multiple surgeries. The medic paused, momentarily startled by the extent of the previous trauma. Staff Sergeant Zane, assisting with Mercer's evacuation, froze at the sight, his eyes widening with sudden recognition. "Wait. Those scars," he said slowly. "Were you at Firebase Alliston 3 years ago?" Freya's expression changed almost imperceptibly, the first crack in her carefully maintained composure. "That's classified, Sergeant," she replied quietly. But Zane was already remembering, fragments of the worst day of his military career coming into focus. A remote outpost overrun, his unit surrounded after a brutal ambush, multiple casualties, and a helicopter that came when no one else would, braving impossible conditions to attempt rescue. Before he could say more, the medic finished applying a quick field dressing to Freya's leg. "You're cleared to continue if you're able," he informed her. Without further acknowledgement, Freya adjusted her rucksack and returned to the trail, disappearing around a bend in the path. She was now the lead candidate, the only one still moving forward while others had fallen behind or been evacuated. Zane watched her go, his mind racing with implications. He keyed his radio. "Captain Thorne, this is Zane. I think I know who Huxworth really is." The radio crackled with Thorne's response. "So do I. Just got her full file. Get back to the finish line. You're going to want to see this." Firebase Alliston, 3 years earlier. The remote outpost sat precariously on Afghanistan's eastern border, a position never meant to be permanent that had somehow become essential to regional operations. When the attack came, it arrived from multiple directions simultaneously, a sophisticated ambush that quickly overwhelmed the small defending force. Staff Sergeant Zane, then a junior specialist, remembered the chaos in fragments. The initial explosion that collapsed their primary defensive position, the frantic radio calls for support, the growing realization that they were too far from any quick reaction force to receive timely help. His team had been pinned down for hours, ammunition dwindling, casualties mounting. When the radio crackled with news that a combat search and rescue team was inbound despite the high-risk conditions, no one truly believed help would arrive in time. Yet somehow, impossibly, the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors had cut through the gunfire as a Black Hawk appeared low over the ridgeline, taking immediate fire but continuing its approach. The helicopter had hovered precariously at the extraction point as a Pararescue jumper fast roped down, a compact figure moving with practiced efficiency to organize the wounded. Zane remembered her face briefly as she assessed his leg wound, where a bullet had shattered his femur. Priority 1, she designated him, securing him for extraction while returning fire to cover their position. Her voice had been calm despite the chaos, her movements decisive as she helped load the wounded onto the hovering aircraft. As the helicopter took fire during extraction, she had secured 2 critical casualties on board. Just as she helped Zane, his memory clouded by pain and blood loss, the helicopter had taken a direct hit to its tail rotor. The violent spinning that followed, the impact as they crashed 2 miles from the extraction point, had left Zane unconscious. He awoke to find the pilot dead, the co-pilot critically injured, and the pararescue specialist applying a tourniquet to her own leg where a piece of the helicopter had impaled it. Despite her injury, she had organized the survivors, administering morphine to the wounded and establishing a defensive position as enemy forces closed in. When it became clear that staying with the downed helicopter meant certain death, she had made an impossible choice, carrying Zane and another wounded soldier 4 miles through hostile territory to the nearest friendly position. For miles with a shattered femur of her own, stopping periodically to administer medical aid while evading enemy patrols, how they had survived remained a blur to Zane, who had drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the ordeal. What he did remember with perfect clarity was her face, strained but determined, refusing to leave anyone behind despite her own catastrophic injury. The mission had been classified due to unauthorized cross-border operations. The survivors were debriefed separately and sworn to secrecy. Zane had never learned the pararescue specialist's name, and his efforts to find information about her had been blocked by layers of classification, until now. The finish line of the Crucible March stood in a clearing at the base of the mountain range, a simple banner stretched between 2 poles marking the end of the 72-mile course. Captain Thorne waited with a small group of instructors, not expecting any arrivals for several hours. The radio chatter had kept him informed of the deteriorating situation on the course. Only 5 candidates still moving, all of them hours from completion based on their last reported positions. On the table before him lay the classified file he had finally received on Sergeant Freya Huxworth. Photographs of the Firebase Alliston rescue operation, medical reports detailing her extensive injuries, and the Silver Star citation that had never been publicly awarded due to the operation's classified nature. Thorne read the citation again, still processing its contents. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. After her rescue helicopter was shot down, Sergeant Huxworth, despite sustaining a catastrophic femoral fracture and significant blood loss, evacuated 2 critically wounded soldiers through 4 miles of enemy-controlled territory, maintaining security and providing medical care throughout the journey. Her actions directly resulted in saving the lives of 4 service members under impossible circumstances. The medical reports that followed documented the extensive damage to her left leg. Shattered femur requiring multiple reconstruction surgeries, severed nerves, compromised circulation requiring tissue grafts. The final page contained the Medical Review Board's recommendation. Permanent disability, medical discharge strongly advised. Yet somehow, Freya Huxworth had not only remained in service, but had now nearly completed one of the military's most physically demanding selection courses. A voice called from the observation point, interrupting Thorne's thoughts. Movement on the trail, sir. Thorne looked up, surprised. Based on the last checkpoint reports, no one should be arriving for at least another 4 hours. He raised his binoculars, focusing on the distant figure emerging from the tree line. A solitary candidate moved steadily along the final stretch, maintaining a consistent pace despite the obvious fatigue of nearly 70 miles of continuous movement. "Is that Huxworth?" asked one of the instructors incredulously. It was, still maintaining the same measured pace she had started with 72 miles ago. Freya approached the finish line alone. Her uniform was mud-stained and sweat-soaked, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her steps remained steady, rhythmic, relentless. She crossed the finish line with no fanfare, no celebration, simply stopping when she reached the designated point and removing her rucksack methodically. The instructors stood in stunned silence as medical staff rushed forward to assess her condition. Captain Thorne checked his watch. 63 hours. Breaking the course record by 5 hours. "Is anyone else finished yet, sir?" she asked, her voice hoarse from exertion but steady. "No, Sergeant," Thorne responded, a new understanding in his voice. "You're the first. The only one so far." She nodded once, accepting a canteen from a medic while allowing another to check her vital signs. Unlike many finishers who collapsed or displayed emotional releases upon completion, Freya remained composed, methodically attending to her immediate needs. Hydration, minor wound care, equipment organization. Staff Sergeant Zane arrived at the finish area minutes later, having been transported from his checkpoint position. He approached Freya with a different manner than before, not the evaluating instructor, but a soldier facing someone who had once saved his life. "You carried me out," he said quietly. "Firebase Alliston. That was you." Freya met his gaze evenly. "Classified operation, Sergeant." "I never knew your name," Zane's voice held a complex mixture of emotions. "They wouldn't tell us afterward. All this time I've been watching you struggle through this course, not realizing." "I wasn't struggling," Freya interrupted calmly. "I was pacing." The realization dawned on Zane's face. Her consistent performance regardless of terrain, her methodical approach to each challenge, her unwavering determination. She hadn't been fighting to keep up. She had been executing a precisely calculated strategy based on intimate knowledge of her own limitations and strengths. Over the next 8 hours, 4 more candidates completed the course, exhausted, pushed to their limits, but successful. Lieutenant Calloway arrived third, his earlier mockery replaced by quiet respect when he saw Freya already recovered and helping organize supplies for the remaining finishers. 1 week later, the graduation ceremony for the selection course took place on the parade ground. Only 8 candidates eventually completed the crucible, earning their places in the elite operational teams. They stood at attention in their dress uniforms as Captain Thorne addressed the small audience of instructors and program officials. Before presenting Freya with her certificate of completion, Captain Thorne called the formation to attention. Every instructor, including Master Sergeant Daxon who had dismissed her chances from the beginning, rendered a formal salute. 3 years ago, Thorne began, Sergeant Huxworth was told she would never walk normally again, let alone continue her military career. Her injuries, sustained during a classified rescue operation, were deemed career-ending by multiple medical review boards. He paused, looking directly at Freya. What her doctors didn't account for was her extraordinary will. Thorne revealed he had obtained special permission to acknowledge her previously classified Silver Star, awarded for the Firebase Alliston rescue but never publicly presented due to operational security concerns. As he read the citation aloud, the remaining candidates who had once mocked her limp stood in stunned silence, now understanding that her physical limitation wasn't a sign of weakness. It was evidence of strength they couldn't comprehend. After the ceremony concluded, Lieutenant Calloway approached Freya awkwardly, his usual confidence absent. "I owe you an apology," he began. "I judged you without knowing." "You judged me exactly as I expected," she interrupted. "The difference is I didn't need your approval then," and I don't need your apology now. After a pause, she added more gently, but I accept it anyway. Learn from it. Calloway nodded, genuine respect replacing his former arrogance. I will. Staff Sergeant Zane waited until the others had dispersed before approaching with his family, a woman and 2 children who had attended the ceremony. The younger child stared openly at Freya's leg, not understanding the significance but sensing the adult's reverence. This is the woman I told you about, Zane said to his family, his voice thick with emotion. The one who carried me home when I couldn't walk. His wife stepped forward, embracing Freya tightly. Thank you, she whispered. We owe you everything. Freya returned the embrace briefly, uncomfortable with the recognition but accepting it with grace. You would have done the same, she replied simply. 3 months later, Freya boarded a helicopter with her new team, all graduates from the course who had proven themselves during selection. Her limp was still present, a permanent reminder of her sacrifice, but no one mentioned it. Each member carried their own scars, visible and invisible, markers of the paths that had brought them to this elite unit. The unit patches on their shoulders showed they were part of a specialized search and rescue detachment, a team specifically trained for impossible extractions under hostile conditions. As they prepared for their first deployment together, there was no trace of the doubt that had once surrounded Freya's capabilities. She had earned her place not despite her injury, but because of what it represented. An unbreakable will and a refusal to abandon others regardless of personal cost. As the helicopter lifted off, the camera caught a glimpse of Freya's helmet, where her newly assigned call sign had been stenciled. Last one. The nickname was no longer a mockery of her physical limitation, but a recognition of her most defining quality. The determination to remain standing when everyone else had fallen. The helicopter banked toward the distant mountains, Freya looking out over the landscape with quiet readiness, prepared for whatever challenges awaited. The journey had never been about proving others wrong. It had been about proving to herself that limitations existed only in the minds of those who accepted them. In the distance, dawn broke over the mountain peaks, illuminating the path ahead with golden light.